Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Having got 2 weeks into the Fringe, we thought it was time for the regular annual discussion with Richard Jordan. I'm Philip Fisher from British Theatre Guide. Richard is a producer who's had, I don't know, how many years of Edinburgh experience have you got now?
Well, it's interesting. I realised, because I was asked this question the other day, that I'd been coming to Edinburgh since 1986. Which when I first came up when I was about, I think, 12 years old, and my mum and dad brought me up. So I can remember Edinburgh when there still were intervals at the assembly rooms, and they used to come out with an ice cream tray and offer anyone an ice cream. And then I think I first came up professionally working on a show in about 1993, and then in 1998 when I formed my own production company, the first show I ever did was in Edinburgh. And so I've been coming every year since 1986, producing here since 1998.
So it's kind of 20, 25 or 30 years, as the question may be, depending on exactly what the question was.
It's kind of interesting sort of observing how the Fringe has kind of evolved, really, in good ways and bad ways. I mean,
just before we start on that, so we'll call it 20 years of doing it very seriously professionally. Do you ever kind of feel, as we are 2.5 weeks in, oh gosh, I really wish I could go to bed and forget about it and skip it, or do you love it? Do you thrive on it?
I think it's exhausting, but it's also quite a nice energy fix in the middle of the year. I think, like all things, it really depends on the work and you know, for me as a producer, it's a very valuable place to come and test work. It's also a very big trade show, and of course this year it's a biannual year of the British Council Showcase, which is, you know, every other year the British Council brings a large group of delegates into Edinburgh. There's a series of shows that they're coming to watch. Of course, that filters out into a whole lot of other shows that are going on elsewhere in Edinburgh. So, you know, it's kind of an essential part of the year.
Do you work with the British Council at all?
I do. I was fortunate that they gave me an award a few years ago as one of their young creative entrepreneurs, which got me to India. And I did a research trip with them to India, and then we've done several shows which the British Council's helped us support and have been great facilitators. I mean, perhaps most notably one of those being Roadkill, which began in Edinburgh and then came back in the British Council Showcase a year later, and then that helped us take it to Chicago and New York and Paris. So, you know, I mean, the British Council are an amazing facilitator at networks and bringing people together.
I never think of the British Council as being promoters to get shows to places like New York and Paris. I always think of kind of the back of beyond, and those cities would count as the back of beyond.
I think it's important to think about how many offices there are at the British Council around the world. And actually, probably one might say with Brexit, their footprint at the moment has probably never been more important in the awareness of British work. And of course, they're working with far less funding than they used to receive, which of course is an endemic problem of many things. So, I actually think the role that they do, as well as the issues that are dealt with. I mean, there's a huge awareness that they're working on at the minute with accessibility. They're doing some very important work in Japan with audience access at the moment. And, you know, like with anything, I mean, I suppose I come to Edinburgh to learn. I do that with everything I go to see in the theatre, but Edinburgh is a wonderful learning ground. You can come and discover the young artists that are coming up. It's interesting to see what those voices want to write about and what they want to talk about. And in a business where you never stop learning, there's these little gems that can throw up and you can get discovered. I mean, for me, for example, I'm blindsided on an Idol Tuesday here in Edinburgh, where I suddenly glance in the programme and there's Wise Kaufman, the great legendary Broadway director and playwright, giving a masterclass, and so there I find myself, of all places, in the Space venue at 10 a.m. sitting there hearing the creator of the Laramie Project and numerous other shows talking about his work, and those kind of things. I mean, similarly, Rachel Tucker, the great young musical actress, star of Wicked, doing 2 almost secret gigs at the Pleasance Theatre on the first Sunday and Monday of the Fringe, and yet it was rather exciting because there was me and about 100 other people in the room, and of course, in a much more intimate setting than you probably ever see her performing again. And I think, again, you're almost getting a masterclass in musical theatre performance, and those kind of nuggets and gems are always invaluable.
And you've tried a new venture this year because I'll express this carefully, I might get it wrong. You've set up your own kind of micro or pop-up venue within the Summer Hall. Well, I
have to an extent. This year, I'm involved with a show with Ontroerend, a company whose work I produce, and we're doing a show called Lies. It's all about capitalism. It's a show in which we need a sort of found space to do it. And so I knew we were going to do it last year, and I knew that we couldn't possibly do it in a venue where you had, a 25-minute or 30-minute setup. So with a little bit of searching, I found a space within the Summer Hall complex, which was being sublet to the Rose Bruford Drama School. And it seemed like this would be the perfect home for the show. So Rose Bruford came on a sort of, we took each other's hands in a sort of act of faith to have a go at seeing if we could make this work. And within that, we then also recognised that it would probably be quite a good space to put 3 of the other Big in Belgium shows. And Big in Belgium's the 5th year of a season that I produce and curate with, created by David Bounds, the long-running general manager of Ontroerend. And it was a mad idea that we put together 5 years ago now. And so this year it's got its own little home. And that's also helped because one of the other shows I'm doing is performed on an ice skating rink, which is quite impressive because it can go up in about 45 minutes. But again, you need its own space for that to happen, and aptly called On Ice. So, so I've gone into the sort of intriguing world of health and safety and audience access and things, but it's a space that I think we will also use in future years. We have that arrangement that we can do that, so it's been quite a helpful and useful, I've had all-day technical rehearsals and, been a very sort of nice way of working and getting the show in.
And has it made your life even harder, or has it just replaced one lot of hard with another?
I think it's just replaced one lot of hard with another. Although in some ways it's taken some of the pressure off because, being able to have that time in the space to work on something. I'm very proud of, I'm always very proud of all the shows I produce, but I'm very, very proud of that season of work because we've been able to do some really nice stuff within the space with the lighting rigs and the team who work at Upper Church there are a wonderful team of people who've helped us to achieve that.
So what do you make of... We're not into British Council Week, that starts day after tomorrow, but what do you make of Edinburgh 2017? A good year, a bad year, a year?
It's interesting. I mean, I had the same question last year. I wouldn't describe it necessarily as a vintage Edinburgh year. I wonder in some ways if that is oddly conversely a problem of the British Council Showcase year, where that needs to be here because there are so many international delegates that are going to be in the city from next week, feels that you need to have some presence there. So I think there's some work where I sort of seen and thought, if only there was another draft of this, it would be really fantastic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is a problem. I find it a bit flat in some places. I mean, everyone's told me that it's bumper year, the business is booming, and I haven't seen that so much. But it's been quite cold on the streets. So normally when you walk around and you see those crowds of people in the bars, maybe they've just all gone indoors because it's quite... I think it's one of the coldest Edinburghs I can remember. So yeah, I mean it's been an interesting year. I mean there's another week still to go. I think there are some gems that will pop up. I mean there's obvious themes. I mean transgender has been an enormous theme running through this year's festival. So I mean that has been a real driving subject. I mean there's been a lot of plays about suicide and depression, it seems, this year as well, which seems to be another, core agenda and theme. So, it's an interesting year when you get some of those emergence. A little bit of Brexit and a bit of Trump.
It's interesting. We tend to see the higher profile shows at the higher profile venues, and you just wonder whether, having seen maybe 6 or 7 transgender plays out of perhaps 60, 70, 80, 100 that we might manage to see at the very most, whether that's actually 6, 7 or 8 transgender plays out of 3,000 shows as well.
Yes.
And ditto, I would guess there's probably a lot more about depression, but I don't know that. Again, I've seen similar numbers.
Yeah.
And we can get slightly blink and get a different view from, the average punter could come up and see 10, 15, 20 shows and not see anything transgender, anything about depression, either trying to avoid them or not.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the interesting thing is, I usually go and see everything that plays at the Travis Theatre. It's always, you get a few bolt holes, you always know you're going to watch stuff at Sutherland's. And certainly there's been a particular theme of transgender work and diversity work being featured inside in that programme. It's almost been a curated programme with that focus.
Well, I think it was. I think it was announced to be.
So I had a situation on Friday last week where I saw 4 transgender plays in succession by the nature of that.
Well, I managed in 2 days to see more transgender plays than I'd seen in my whole life.
Yeah, and oddly, I mean, the best transgender play I've seen is not in this Edinburgh Festival. It was a couple of years ago, which was the piece Transcripts that was done at the Pleasance. It won a Fringe first. Very talented writer and director Paul Lucas, American, who put it together and had spent a couple of years of travelling around the world interviewing transgender men and women for that piece, and I still actually think out of all the works I've seen that still is the piece that's really stuck with me. I mean, it's a very big issue. It's a huge issue now in America, transgender, which we need to be thinking about with Trump repealing those decisions and those rules that Obama came in. It's certainly a very important issue that we need to be drawing attention to. I mean, I was interested in being in New York a few months ago to go to the Jujamson chain of theatres and now see that they have transgender neutral toilets, whatever however you identify yourself, feel free to use these restrooms. That's a very important element. To me, it was the most important message in American theatre when that emerged in November last year. I noticed the Travis is carrying those similar notices on its toilet doors. So I do think it's an important issue. I wonder if, though, audiences respond as much about wanting to see as much about trans. I mean, I don't know if you go to the Travers whether you are saying, "God, that's fantastic, I'm going to see 8 or 9 transgender plays on the subject whilst I'm here," or do you become more selective in what you see?
I suspect that most people... I wouldn't be surprised if most people say, "I don't want to see a transgender play," and those people that are more adventurous, if that's the right term, want to see a transgender play. I can't imagine that many people want to see 4 or 5 transgender plays with the definite knowledge that some are going to be better than others, and therefore you're going to be watching some either all going to be exceptional better, or, as is the case here to me, one of them is really superb. Then they're kind of running downwards on a scale from really superb to not particularly good.
The question is, does the audience duck and dive more? So does the audience that once used to go to everything, say at the Travis, says, "I'm actually going to just see 2 plays at the Travis on this subject and see some other stuff," or are they going to book for the whole season? I suspect if you want to see everything
at the Travis, you're talking about £300 plus.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's not a cheap place to go and necessarily watch a show. But no, I mean, my curiosity is the fact of often people would just open the brochure and book for everything at the Travis. I know I used to always do that.
But as I said, now with the economics, I wouldn't be surprised if some people actually are willing to spend £100 at Travis, which 5 shows or 6 shows shall I pick?
And then the question is there enough of a capacity to drive that through that number of transgender plays that are on there? And
the box office will tell.
Yeah, I think it will be. But I mean, I think the Travis's program has been quite a good one this year. I mean, I've enjoyed Letters to Morrissey. I thought that was good. Nassim, it was interesting to see that work. I liked that work actually more than White Rabbit, Red Rabbit, his earlier play. Yeah. I saw it with Nina Conti, who was certainly a very good performer to perform with him. I haven't seen Meet Me at Dawn yet, which I'm seeing next week, but I hear good things about that. Nina, sadly, I missed because the day I was going, Josette had lost her voice, so I shall see that somewhere.
That wouldn't be much of a show with no voice.
No, I shall see that somewhere else on the trail. But I mean, I thought my favourite show at the Travis has been Jess and Joe Forever, which I thought was, of course, a play that had come up from the Orange Tree, and I thought was a really good Travis piece, and I thought beautifully performed by the 2 young actors in that.
Moving away, I'd like to pick on the South African season. I don't know how many of those you've seen at some point over the last few years, if not this year. There are 6 plays from the Baxter Theatre Centre at University of Cape Town. Well,
I've had the pleasure to produce with the Baxter. I did a play with them some years ago called It's a Sing.
Oh right, I remember, yes.
Which we opened at the Baxter, then took to the Market Theatre, and then actually brought it to Edinburgh, and had the good fortune of winning one of the awards up here, and then has toured extensively all over the world. And to me, the Baxter Theatre is the powerhouse of South African theatre. That and the Market, those 2 theatres.
Yes, agreed.
Turn out some amazing work. I'm slowly working through the season. I haven't seen The Fall yet, but I'm very excited to see it.
The Fall is very exciting, so you'll enjoy that.
And so I'm looking forward to that. Ms. Julie, I saw on its previous visit.
Me too, yeah.
I think Yael Farber is the real deal. I mean, I'm one of the people who is more in a minority who actually very much respected Salome when I saw it at the National
in London, yeah.
There was a couple of things, I think, on that production, actually, she's one of those directors who knows how to work the space. The Olivier is a really difficult space to make work, and she understands that. But I do think, and it's actually a thing about Edinburgh in general, and actually Salome in a sense in London, I saw that show with having had a very lazy afternoon and came and fell into the National Theatre to see it. If I had rushed from work and sat down, I would have had a totally different feel on the show. And it's a very similar context to watching a show in Edinburgh. that if you rush into something and you sort of hassled a bit to get there and you've had to fight your way through the box office, you actually are not always focused for the first 15-20 minutes of a 1 hour show on what you're watching.
Well, what I've found more and more this year is the other way, which is shows that have either come up late or overrun significantly, and you tend to be rushing. Well, I'm certainly rushing around in Edinburgh the whole time, even if it's only to get a 10-minute break to write something, eat something, or breathe. And the show that is 10 minutes late is probably going to leave me sprinting across town, and I get really resentful. And it's very rare that a lot of shows up here could do with a bit of cutting. So the one that's 70 minutes that's supposed to be an hour should probably have been 45 minutes to start with.
But here is an interesting, problem again. Is this question of the 1 hour show? Going back to, as I say, when I first came in '86 and we used to have intervals. I think back to some of the work that I saw at that point, and people like the David Glass Ensemble, Alan Bates doing his incredible one-man show, A Muse of Fire, which was truly spectacular in the Music Hall at Edinburgh. David Glass Ensemble, the Hull Truck Theatre Company doing, I think it's the first Romeo and Juliet I ever saw was the Hull Truck Theatre Company coming here. Sweet Sorrow, it was a beautiful Alan Plater play that came here. Then all the people like Spike Milligan, Dario Fo, Complicité, because of course we forget that the Perrier Award once many years ago didn't actually go always to comedians. Complicité won the Perrier Award for Best Comedy, and then of course the advent of comedy happened in the early 90s, of the explosion of stand-up comedy in Edinburgh, and the idea that Complicité would ever win a Perrier Award now or any comedy would be kind of like extraordinary. So in a sense it is a problem, because to me a 1 hour show is perfect in Edinburgh. But if you think about it, if you're putting that show on, I don't know, in Norwich, and you're going to a 45-minute show, and it takes you as long to get to the theatre as it does to get home, well, that's not really your evening out. There is an issue on that. And then there is an issue about cutting, because sometimes that play, you can't butcher it or cut it down in such a way, because the play is the play. But you make often very big concessions, because you've got to fit that Edinburgh time slot to be able to make the show. And
you turn a good play into a bad play by doing so.
You do.
Too often.
You do. The Divide, the Alan Ayckbourn double bill.
You're saying that's been cut to 6 hours and has lost the results?
The original Divide was much longer than that, but it's been, the original reading of it, as I said, it's Stephen Joseph, ran for much, much longer. So the play, I think, was getting on for 9 hours, maybe 10 hours. So it's been cut down to 6.5, 7 hours. That's a lot of play to cut. And I have to say, I'm in another camp that, I read many of the reviews for The Divide that did not like the production. I actually felt that what Alan Ayckbourn did in that play was quite fearless, because I would have bettered if you just picked the play up and you didn't know who wrote it. You would have never said that was an idea. Bits of it were closer to David Gregg in some places with some of the idea of it. And it's interesting, because of course Man Watching over at the Roundabout has made a deliberate point of not even naming who the writer is. It's a completely anonymous play, being read by a different comedian each evening. But The Divide, I actually thought was a very interesting, because the second part is laboured and needs a little bit more cutting. The problems I felt intrinsically with The Divide actually sat a lot in the direction and the design in places, but the acting was beautiful in it. And I felt there was stuff within that play that was actually incredibly interesting, and I don't think it had as fair a crack as perhaps it is. Also, I think the other thing is, it opened on August the 8th, it pressed on the 14th. It's a 2-part epic play. I get it that you've got to get it open and you've got to sell tickets in Edinburgh and you've got to get the reviews in for the international festival, but in a perfect way they would have been better not to have actually had the press night until the end of the festival, because you're working on a play that's going to evolve in such a big way.
It is going to the Old Vic, so I don't know whether. I'll be fascinated, if nothing else, to see what the running time is at the Old Vic.
You worry though with the reviews now whether that will make it a harder sell in the Old Vic, and there's a lot of things that are quite interesting in The Divide. It's by no means it needs a considerable amount of work still. But it was
interesting. You talked about work that comes to Edinburgh and opens too early. I think even at 6 hours, The Divide.
But there's an enormous problem with this. If you take into consideration Robert Lepage, arguably the Quebecan theatre director, one of the great artists of his generation. But a Lepage show over many years used to evolve. So if you saw the first incarnation of Seven Streams of the River Otter, for example, in its very first festival where that played, it was a bit of a mess. It was okay, but it was going to evolve over 2 years to where it ended up eventually at the National Theatre. was extraordinary. I mean, it's one of the great National Theatre epic two-part shows. But it took that time to get to that point. And I also think nowadays, and I wonder with things like the immediacy of the internet and people being able to blog and comment on stuff quite quickly, whether it becomes harder for those sort of artists. I mean, when Lepage, a couple of years ago, did Playing Cards, the piece that came to the Roundhouse, that was going to be those suits of cards that were going to be made across the... Of course, the early runs of that were attacked quite heavily by the press from different countries, and of course it's sort of like the project was abandoned. Whereas roll back maybe 10 years earlier, without necessarily such a strong social media footprint, people may have had more courage to let something evolve and try it. And I think with The Divide, that the problem is you can't work on a show like that and get it up as quickly as that in that sort of epic version. It needs a very long preview period, and I think that was a very big misstep. That being said, The Divide is the sort of play I think that the Edinburgh International Festival should be doing.
No, agreed.
Ayckbourn is the most performed British playwright after William Shakespeare. People raised an eyebrow when Ayckbourn was announced in the programme. We wouldn't have the same thing if it was probably Tom Stoppard or Michael Frayn. And actually, it's such a different play to any other Ayckbourn play I've ever seen. Yeah. It should be being embraced in a festival context.
That's new writing, but not new writing in the sense that many people would understand. What has excited you in terms of new writing at the Fringe? Can I just chuck in Payne's Plough Roundabout, which seems to be a great source?
I think Payne's Plough is probably the great jewel of new writing now at the Edinburgh Fringe. I think the work there that I've seen, Pike Street and Elijah Sun's work.
Which is actually from Barrow Street in New York.
Well, great theatre in New York.
Yeah.
And I thought it was fantastic. I think she's great. I haven't seen Black Mountain, but I hear very good things. Out of Love, I thought was good. Box Clever, I thought was an interesting...
But Box Clever, I kind of feel it seemed an incredibly young company, and I didn't think it quite worked. But having said that, the promise it was showing, the promise that she was showing, was amazing, and I think there's something really special
and
there.
And she, of course, is Montse Whitney is also the actress in the show.
She's one of the two actors there, but it's kind of the other one just kind of provides support on doing a lot more.
But I thought there was quite a lot of stuff to be quite. I thought that there was an interesting new voice there, and I thought there was a middle child show in the roundabout, the sort of gig theatre, which seems to be another trend that's emerging now. And I thought it was Luke Barnes. I thought had written again a very interesting and entertaining show, which was connecting with a huge crowd of young people who were having the best time of their lives in there. So I think the roundabout is a really important bonus to...
And then the sad thing is there must be 1,000 examples of new writing, 900 plus of which none of us ever get to see because there's too much going on. And some of them, the vast majority, probably aren't worth seeing, but we must be missing some superstars in the making.
And I think, sometimes when there's so many shows, it's hard for the press to all get round, so of course you're not always hearing those voices as quickly. I enjoyed very much a super happy... sad
story about feeling
sad. Story about feeling super sad.
Everyone I've spoken to who's seen it is in love with that show, and it was a little show about depression. It was a happy little musical about depression, and it was just wonderful. So by John Britton, who has made a name for himself.
John Britton did Rotterdam,
yes,
of course, and won the Olivier Award for, I think, outstanding achievement this last year for that. I thought this was a better play than Rotterdam. I thought it was more interesting in where it went.
This is the thing that interests me about it is it was the hour-long Edinburgh show, and maybe, as you were saying earlier, if it could be turned into a 90-minute show, which is probably quite easy to do, then it can go big elsewhere.
And it's come from Hull, from the City of Culture programme. I thought that it was almost what you describe as a quintessential Perfect Fringe show, in the sense that it had that sort of energy that you want, and a real youthfulness, and on a very difficult subject. And I was really happy to make that. It was one of the shows I'd actually circled in the brochure before I'd even got here, saying I want to see that. And I think I went on the first Sunday of and I had a really great time. I mean, my great bugbear was that they hadn't produced a programme. I think 15% of the shows I've probably been to this year have actually been ones where they handed out a free sheet or a programme. And you look at a great bunch of actors and you say, how do I know anything about you? And of course, in the end, I actually found one of the actresses in the street and said, you haven't got a programme. And she emailed me a programme that they released sort of a few weeks later.
That has been a big problem as a critic, trying to write reviews. If you want to single out actors who can't find you give up.
It seems to me to be so asinine because you've spent all this money to come to Edinburgh. There's a huge amount of money that's spent to come to the Fringe. You come for many reasons, but one of those is the fact that hopefully, maybe a producer or casting director or a theatre spots you, but you've got no way of knowing who any of these people are afterwards and following up, and it's like the simplest thing in the world. All you've got to do is have an A4 sheet. But
which can't cost a lot of money.
No, but it's that impossibility of follow-up, and I worry about that. I feel very sad about it, because I know when I get to the end of the Fringe, I'm sitting there trying to scratch my head to work out who
and it's interesting that it's gone out of fashion, because it used to be just about every show would produce something that you could take away that give you the information. And maybe I've done a bit better than you, but probably 40-50% maximum.
I also think there's a responsibility here of the producers and the people who are creating those shows, because those artists, you want that representation. But I mean, from my perspective, we have a little handout program, sheet program at every show I produce, because it's the way that people contact us afterwards to say, I really like that.
Yeah, and I assume that the cost to you of doing that rather than not doing that is in tens of pounds rather than hundreds, probably.
Well, I mean, what you print off 500 A4 sheets, if that's the case, about £30? But actually, if that yields out all the interest and follow-up that you have afterwards, well,
it only needs one of those 500 to hit home, and you've got your 30 quid back.
Well, yes, and also just so that the audience knows a little bit about you, and also who the cast are and things. I mean, I like having a programme. I like you, keep all my theatre programmes, so I have a huge archive of programmes at home. I use them for casting and references back and all sorts of things. So I'm a great believer in that, and also, in always making sure you have a good biog. I mean, it's a piece of information that's absolutely invaluable.
No, I agree entirely.
So I thought that was great. Taha, I enjoyed very much. Did you see that show?
I saw that in London.
Missed it at the Young Vic, and I was very pleased to have a chance to see it. I thought it was a beautifully told part of the Arab season that's been up here. That's been an interesting trend to see these Arab season, the Canadian season, the Taiwan season, big in Belgium. There's a sort of little model now of all these little...
Well, and the Australians, and the South African,
and New Zealand. There's a New Zealand festival this year as well.
It's interesting because there's obviously a cultural movement in all of these countries where there's state funding or local funding to promote the country or province or whatever, as the case may be, and they're willing to spend money to send people to the UK. And you just wonder, with the way our country is going at the moment, whether the British Council, I suppose, is the equivalent, is really going to be willing to do the same in future.
Well, I mean, that's what we'll sit to see, I guess. But I mean, I think one of the great things is when we know when funding's being cut and it's getting expensive to go to places. If you come to Edinburgh, you can see a lot of shows, both in the International Festival, the Book Festival. So actually, if you are a theatre or a producer deciding I've got to make some cuts, this is one place where it still stays valuable to come because of that volume. So I would hope that people like the New Zealands and those places and Australian showcases, I hope that they'll continue, because I think they're actually a really good addition into the festival. I mean, the South African season's been a proven one with the work that's been coming through and doing that. And I think it does afford you an awareness of stuff to see. And of course, what's great is you can then pool together a group of shows and bring them over. And the most great thing about an international festival is discovering those themes and how they interconnect with people's lives, and how you find that actually things are really closely connected. And again, in the current climate that we're in, I guess the feeling of art and community have never been more important. I think with Edinburgh, that comes back to the fact that Edinburgh, or from the years I've been coming, it's a community. The aspect of it is engagement in community. The only place you blindly take a piece of advice from someone in the street about a show from someone you've never met before. I mean, where else does that happen? It's the only place where suddenly Lynn Gardner tweets, "I've got an hour free, what show should I go and see?" Those kind of engagements, they don't happen anywhere else, except they happen on the streets of Edinburgh. And I think ultimately, if you've got a city, which Edinburgh is afforded with wonderful cultural collision, the more cultural collisions you have of people getting out and colliding in the street and talking to each other, out of that comes ideas, and out of that comes possibly theatre shows or exposure to culture. And actually, in the times we're in, the role that theatre has to play in that, I think, in quite difficult economic, social circumstances of what we're watching going on around the world, I think its role has never been more important.
That's a perfect moment to end the advert for Edinburgh from Richard Jordan. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Welcome to the Edinburgh panel for 2017. We've got a very distinguished cast for ourselves. We've got Joyce McMillan of the Scotsman, Marc Fisher, who is freelance, and I'm Philip Fisher from British Theatre Guide. We are probably all very tired, having got a couple of weeks into the festival and Fringe, but it means we've seen a lot. Joyce, do you want to tell us about the big in every sense play in the International Festival, The Divide, by Alan Ayckbourn?
Yes, indeed. The Divide is a new work by Alan Ayckbourn, and he says that when he first began to write it, he wasn't even sure that it would be a play at all. It's so different in sort of scale and style from anything that he's done before. Alan Ayckbourn, of course, best known for his kind of social comedies and satires from the 1970s and 1980s, but has also in the past written quite a few plays which are sort of science fiction or science fantasy plays. But this is completely different in scale. It's an epic drama of 6 hours, 2 3-hour halves, which is set in an England which is 100 years in the future. The country has been devastated by a plague, which has the very particular effect not only of greatly reducing the population, but of leaving behind a situation where the women are carriers, allegedly anyway, of this virus, and the men are the vulnerable victims of it. So the result of that is that a society has grown up in which men and women live completely separate lives on either side of an actual physical barrier. They don't share the same space. Heterosexual relationships are taboo. Conception is entirely by artificial insemination, and the children grow up with their mothers, and if they're girls they stay there, and if they're boys, when they reach sort of 15, 18, that sort of age, they have to leave and go to the men's side of the barrier. So Ayckbourn in The Divide kind of wholly imagines this society, but he does it in a very Ayckbourn-like way, and we see the whole thing through the eyes of this young girl called Soween, and also of her brother, who's just a little older than her, called Elihu. And Soween wants to be a writer right from the start, so that's how she sees herself. So in a sense, the whole play is like a sort of tribute to the creative spirit. Soween writes, and her brother is very, very good at drawing, visual art, and drawing and painting. And so the two of them are very creative kids. They're brought up by this female couple, which is the norm, and they're two female parents. And they see this whole society from a sort of child's perspective, which means that we see both the sort of extreme authoritarianism of it and the very, very puritanical rules of conduct by which it operates. But we also see it as very human. You know, we see the relationship between their two female parents. We see their relationship. We see their little sort of acts of rebellion and so on. And then, of course, as they grow up, the rebellion becomes more serious, and Soween becomes a kind of bystander at a heterosexual romance which grows up between one of her friends and her brother, which of course is forbidden. And that is the kind of engine for the change that drives the drama. So it's a huge drama. It has a cast of about 13, so you see this whole society. It's mostly women, but there are also some men, because men do come and go from the other side, and it's just that they have to make sure that they're protected against this infection by wearing kind of masks and so on, and not having any actual physical contact with the women. So there are some male characters. There's young Elihu, there's his tutor Rudgren, who's a very amusing and well-observed character, a kind of bloke who lives on the other side and just clearly isn't getting on with all this at all. His relationships with other men never work out. He's a sort of, you know, secret connoisseur of female porn, all the rest of it, you know. So Rudgren develops into a very rich and very amusing character fairly quickly, and you get the idea that the men's side is, if the women's side is a bit sort of authoritarian and sometimes a bit temperamental, the men's side's a complete mess, full of people getting drunk and fighting each other all the time. So there's a range of characters, some of which are very serious, some of which are very entertaining, and all of this evolves in a very sort of spectacular production by Annabel Bolton, which has really memorable stage pictures, a little bit Handmaid's Tale, except that the women all wear black and the men all wear white. This is to signify that the men are pure and free of the disease, and the women are the sort of tainted ones, you know, the morally inferior ones, the carriers of the disease. And they have this book called the Book of Certitude, which is the kind of Bible of this strange civilization which has grown up, which is full basically of a lot of misogynistic ideas which the women are kind of invited to internalise. So it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a bit of a page turner. You know, it has the kind of atmosphere of a really good novel or a really good box set. It's a good story. You're really keen to see what's going to happen to this little brother and sister as the story evolves. Towards the end, I would say it kind of loses the plot, both literally and metaphorically a bit. the story becomes kind of more and more, there are more and more sort of twists in it towards the end. And then there's a kind of long coda, a last half hour, in which we see Soin as a grown-up and all the rest of it, which is completely unnecessary because we've already glimpsed Soin as a grown-up in a kind of film sequence right at the beginning of the play, and then again there's a little short film at the end. So we know what happens to her, we know that she survives, we know that she grows up to be a woman with children of her own and a male husband and all the rest of it. So we know the basics of that, and yet there's this long sort of spun out last half hour, which is like Ayckbourn's sort of tribute to the kind of normal world of people falling in love and having ordinary relationships and everything going back to normal, basically, which is normal in inverted commas, which is really not necessary because it's all implicit in the story itself. So, about half an hour from the end, there are a series of one or two really brilliant stage pictures which kind of sum up how the story ends, and that's where it should finish. I don't think it'll probably ever be rated as one of Ayckbourn's greatest works, but it's a very, very entertaining piece of work. It's full of insight, and it has this really wonderful central performance from Erin Doherty as Soin, just really drawing everyone in, and a really enchanting performance.
Marc, was it 6 hours of page turner for you?
Well,
still turning the pages for 6 hours?
A lot with what Joyce, in fact, everything that Joyce says, in the sense that it was very, very watchable, and she used the word box set in, and box set in its both most positive and negative light, in the sense that you and to use the example of The Handmaid's Tale, which has just been on television, you watch episode after episode after episode, and on television you let it all glide by, and you're engaged by some bits, and other bits sort of maybe don't engage you as much, but on the telly it doesn't matter so much. And there was that sort of sense of, just keep on going on. You can drift a little bit, and it's still going on when you come back. And I don't think it justified its 6 hours length on that level. But on another level, as soon as you mention The Handmaid's Tale, that it doesn't bear comparison, because on pretty much every level, The Handmaid's Tale is better. There's more jeopardy. There's a darker sense of danger. There's the analysis of misogyny and all the rest of it, and Puritanism is just better in Handmaid's Tale. And I'm not really convinced, much as I quite enjoyed watching it, that this one goes any further. But there's another thing that puzzles me as well, because this, in its original form, that this is a play, or is it even a play? Is it a novel? It's a piece of writing that is 80,000 words long. Ayckbourn, it's phenomenal at the age of 78, he's still rewriting the rule book about what a play could be. So I think it's all credit to him for doing something which, by his own admission, he deliberately set out to write a play that he couldn't direct. It was beyond his reach, and so that was the challenge that he did to himself. So I think that's fantastic that an artist of his stature and his experience is prepared to do that. However, there was an odd feeling I found that I can only really think about two moments when the production itself actually felt experimental, and that would be right at the very beginning when we start with a sort of lecture scenario, and the house lights are up and we're being spoken to, and you get a sense of all the sort of archival material that's been brought together, and then much later on, several days later, several hours later, suddenly there's a sort of reveal, and this fantastic music, and it really is a wonderful score, which has been going on hidden. We suddenly see the community choir at the back of it, and it's a bit like the events, or something like David Gregg's events, or something, and we suddenly say, there's a whole thing here, and that there's a moment of theatrical excitement. And I really can't decide whether it's to Annabel Bolton's credit or detriment that it doesn't feel as whether she's managed to paper over the cracks so much that it doesn't feel experimental, and therefore that's good, or whether actually some bit of texture and friction or something within the production would have been better.
She certainly had a lot of time in which she could have introduced novel elements. With 6 hours of playing time.
And I agree with Marc about the music. The music is terrific. It's a great score, and it's performed by, I think, four musicians live on stage, and this big live community choir. But it's true that that the fact that they're kept invisible so much of the time, it's a lost opportunity for a bit of a more challenging kind of look for the production, a more formal experiment. I mean, it looks very striking, but it certainly doesn't look experimental. I mean, it creates quite interesting stage pictures at a lot of different points in the narrative, but it doesn't go the whole way of having this choir visible all the time. But then you would have to know who the choir were representing in terms of the kind of discipline of this strange society and so on, and that would change their role again if you had to be looking at them all the time. That's a kind of opportunity that hasn't been taken, and it may be, as Marc says, that that's a bad thing. It may be that it's actually just the only way of doing it. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing to stage, obviously. And I mean, it's going to be at the Old Vic in January and February, I think, or February. And I hope that people will go along and see it for the reason that Marc's just mentioned, which is that here you have a playwright who has been probably more performed and more enjoyed by British audiences over the last 40 odd years than any other. And here he is at the age of 78, 79, doing something which is for him completely new. And I don't really quite accept the negative comparison with The Handmaid's Tale, because I don't think, although the look of it is rather similar, because it's referring back to this kind of Puritan way of dressing and all the rest of it, little bonnets and so on. Actually, I think he's trying to do something quite different. I mean, Margaret Atwood is a major global novelist trying to issue a terrible warning about the sheer negative force of patriarchy and what would happen if it was resurgent in that form. And what Alan Ayckbourn's trying to do is something much more humane, I think. He's trying to... I mean, Margaret Atwood's vision is very dark. Ayckbourn is trying to suggest that however much society goes through a kind of revolutionary phase like this, or a repressive phase like this, that there are aspects of human nature which don't change, and that the power of human creativity in particular is always part of change, and encourages people to believe in change. And while that's a rather old-fashioned kind of humanist and humanitarian message, I don't think it's out of place in the debate, if you know what I mean. I think it's a different voice in the kind of debate that The Handmaid's Tale joins, and I think it's a valuable one.
Going in opposite directions, the two analogies that I was drawing while I was watching it were 1984,
yes,
but also The Crucible.
Yes. That's
and
right.
it
looks like The Crucible, but
yeah, and the relationships were both similar, or were similar to both central relationships in those two.
Yes.
I'll call them plays because 1984 has become a play now. Obviously, it was a novel originally. Right, let's move on. The Traverse this year has gone big on diversity, I think intentionally, and one major element of diversity, or almost the major element in their programming, was transgender. And there were, I think, at least 4 plays that were directly about transgender, and 1 or 2 that were pretty close to the subject within a couple of days for us seeing them. For me, the pick of them, by some way actually, was Adam, which is directed by Cora Bissett, who I think is a wonderful director anyway, and it starred Adam himself, who is a man called Adam Kashmiri. And stating a man called Adam Kashmiri, you all just turn your noses up, but since he was born in Egypt, and at that time he was not a man, he was a girl and then a woman, his story becomes far more interesting. And just the fact that he apparently, according to the programme, he wasn't originally going to do it and then was persuaded to. And when you look at him, he looks like a man, everything's like a man, and you just notice there's something slightly odd about his left arm, I think it was. And it meant so much that it was actually him doing it, because he explains at the end that that's a skin graft.
Yeah.
And it's extremely touching. It's a two-hander with him playing himself and an actress whose name I think I'll get right, which is Neshla Kaplan.
That's right.
Playing opposite him. And it just tells his story very gently, quite horrifically at times, from Egypt, where his family couldn't understand anything about him. He then tried to get asylum in Scotland, which was easier said than done, finally managed to get to live in Glasgow. And without wishing to give too much of the game away, you end up with what I think is genuinely a very happy ending, ignoring the fact that part of the happy ending is he's on stage telling his story to a packed house at the Traverse. Marc?
Well, as you say, there are a number of plays this year on the theme of transgender, and a number which are, or at least 3 I can think of, which are the person concerned themselves on the stage telling their story. And there's a sort of consciousness-raising element to that, which we've seen in previous politicised movements, whether it's the women's movement, the AIDS plays that we were seeing in the early 1990s, when this was sort of important for people to share their experiences with a wider audience, and just on the simple level of getting a level of understanding. From a dramatic point of view, I am resistant to the idea of somebody just telling their own story. I like drama. I like conflict, and I think often a fictional story can tell a more powerful dramatic tale than the real life tale. And I just had a slight sense at the end when everybody, a lot of people in the audience were giving standing ovations, and I can't take that away from the National Theatre of Scotland production. But you're kind of thinking, are you applauding the production? Are you applauding the spirit and the resilience of the man concerned? Where is the blend between fact and fiction?
It would have been very interesting had it been presented as entirely fictional. We've not been told that Adam was Adam. What your reaction would have been, and clearly none of us can know.
And would you have written it in quite the same way? And sometimes there's another thing that just bothers me, and it's true of all the plays that we might be talking about, which is that. There's a sort of sense that's unstated, which is that there is somewhere an enemy, something to be resisted against, but that is sort of generalised and never it's very rarely specific. So, in the case of Joe Clifford's Eve, Joe had what sounds like quite a reactionary father, for example. In the case of Adam, we're talking about a reactionary regime that he had to escape from, and some sort of Home Office bureaucracy and so on that had to go through. But kind of hard to point the finger at in terms of political things. If you're going to be politicised, well, what do I do about this? What is the problem that actually needs to be addressed? And in the case of transgender, I'm not too sure what the problem is. If there is one problem, it's maybe general attitudes, and it's sort of very easy to be empathetic and sympathetic and fascinating stories, all the rest of it. But just on a dramatic level, I'm not entirely persuaded.
Okay, of course.
Well, I think I liked Adam a bit more than Marc does. I think Cora Bissett, who has directed this and has won awards last year for her production Glasgow Girls, which again was about asylum seekers in Glasgow, so it's a theme that's very close to Cora's heart. And I think Adam is a show which brings together a lot of the preoccupations of this year's Fringe, because it has this combination of being about a very personal story of kind of very personal pain, which at a certain point in his life Adam was unable to discuss with anyone. Really with anyone at all. I mean, his parents just didn't understand it. No one that people could understand the possibility, some people could understand the possibility that she, the girl that he was, might be gay, but the idea that she might actually want to become a man was just something else again. And so it's a kind of a personal story of a kind that at least some young people, quite a lot of young people, identify with, as this yearning to be yourself, whatever yourself is. But it's also, of course, an intensely political story, both from the point of view of trying to get recognition for transgender people and the recognition that they need, but also from the point of view of his having to leave his country in order to make this journey, and coming up against, when he arrived in Britain, all of the problems that asylum seekers face anyway, with a sort of culture of disbelief at the Home Office, the incredibly small amount of money that they're given to live on, which is really barely enough to survive, and in Adam's case, starving himself literally so that he could get testosterone over the internet because he was so desperate to begin a kind of physical transition to being a man. And so it's a narrative with quite a few layers which are relevant to a lot of other shows this year. There are a lot of shows about the refugee journey in various different forms, and lots of shows about the interface between sort of Western culture and other cultures. So in that sense, I think it brings a lot of these strands together, and I think that partly accounts for the tremendous audience response to it. The other thing which accounts for it is Cora Bissett's style as a director, which is popular and populist, and she uses all the bells and whistles of theatre to make what just basically could just be a monologue. And here is a kind of divided monologue with two performers, representing, Neshla Kaplan represents both other parts of Adam at different times, but also his mother and various other people he meets along the way. And she uses a big score, she uses big visuals, she uses all sorts of sound effects, and she uses this idea which is called the Adam Choir, which is this key moment in the story when Adam first gets hold of a laptop, keys in this question, is it possible for the soul of a boy to be captured in the body of a girl, and finds suddenly all of these transgender people from all over the planet saying, yes it is, don't give up, you're not alone. And that in this production has actually been made flesh in this choir of transgender people from all over the world who sing together online, as it were, which is a beautiful idea. and it's part of the production. So the production has very high production values backed by the National Theatre of Scotland, and that helps to make it into a really strong, popular piece of theatre. So I think bringing together all these strands, both thematically, the idea that it's an authentic performance by the person at the heart of the story himself, and the kind of quality of the production, just makes it into a really big event in Edinburgh this year. So I'm a bit more positive about it. One critic described it as the kind of show that saves lives. And while that's putting it a bit emotively, there is an element of that to it. There are people who really need to hear this.
Fine, Marc, I think we're probably in need of a little bit of light entertainment. So do you want to tell us about, I'll call it Lies, which is the subtitle.
Yeah, and will I be able to get the right denominations? In the programme it's written in the name of the various currencies, so there's a pound sign, a yen sign, a euro sign,
and a dollar.
And a dollar sign, which spells out the word lies. You say it's light, actually, and it's very, very, very enjoyable, but it is on a very serious theme, which is global capitalism. This is the work by Ontroerend Goed, who have been shaking us up, is the best phrase to put it, for several years on the Edinburgh Fringe. I remember seeing them doing, I think, their first show called Smile Off Your Face, a very sensory experience a number of years ago. And the show that this one most reminds me of in its effect, not in its method, but in its effect, is a show called Internal, which had none of the appearance of a piece of theatre, but all of the effects of a piece of theatre. And by that I mean, it doesn't feel like you're having a theatrical experience, but you go out and you think, all the things that I want from theatre, I have had from this production. What this production is about is global capitalism. You go in, a relatively small audience, but in a fairly big space, a number of casino tables around a single room. We have the fireworks to prove we're in Edinburgh. And 6 people around a number of, about half a dozen, 8 tables around a room. And we have a croupier, and we appear to be doing a sort of elaborate game of, we don't know what the game is, it could be poker, it could be some other sort of casino game, but what we're actually playing is the game of global capitalism, and each of these tables is an individual economy, and we realise as the game progresses, as we start betting and building up our financial resources, borrowing money that doesn't really exist, taking credit for money that doesn't really exist, the very concept of paper money is just based on a promise, and so this whole show is based on the promises, and the promises, it all gets much bigger as it's going along, the pot of money, and then we start trading with our neighbouring countries, and then we start realising that there is a very big bubble being built, and the bubbles tend to pop, and I indeed was on the table that that went under. And that's all very fun. It's like playing a big game of Monopoly, and you know how people behave in Monopoly and whatever, but what it helps you do, it's all very, very fast-paced and all the rest of it, it affects you as an individual, and everybody will have a slightly different story, as they did with Internal, as they did with Smile Off Your Face, is that you react to it by thinking, hold on, I suddenly have become, in my case, I'm becoming this rapacious capitalist that I would normally, in political terms, be very much against, but I was the one who was wanting to raise the money, I was the one who was putting back, I was the one who was getting very pissed off by the person on my table who was saying, oh, we should be all egalitarian, and we go, don't do that. And so it teaches you, it unsettles you, it gets under your skin, both in the big game that you're playing, but also in what it tells you about yourself, and I guess about human nature, and actually then the big, I'm sure Joyce will talk interestingly about what it actually has a significance for in the big global game that we're effectively all part of internationally.
In the very small unglobal game, I suspect there were 42 people there, I think every performance, 2 a night. I suspect that some of those people will not get into debt using credit cards that would have done otherwise. So I was on a table with some, in the nicest possible way, very unsophisticated people when it came to finances, and I think they were genuinely surprised and shocked. In the nicest possible way, I kind of guessed what was coming at the end of it, and I was very circumspect the whole way. The people were just astounded about it, and I suspect 1 or 2 people will have their finances saved by this show. Joyce, sorry.
I hope so, the kind of show that saves people's financial lives. I really loved this, and Marc's described it very well. So it is like you just get your chance to play at casino capitalism and to realise how the whole financial system to which we are supposed to kind of bow down and treat as something which can't really be challenged. You can't make water flow upwards, you can't buck the markets, all of that kind of thing. In fact, it is just absolutely a human construct, like a casino game, and if we wanted to change the rules of it, we could. And of course, there have been times in history, like the Bretton Woods conferences after the Second World War, where they did, in an effort to make sure that we wouldn't have events like the crash of 1929, or indeed the crash of 2008, which happened because of a big ideology of banking deregulation after the 1980s. So it's based very solidly on the history of kind of recent management of the world's finances, but what I want to say about it is that it sounds like something that once you've set it up it would just run itself, but it's not like that. The members of Ontroerend Goed, the company, there's a cast of about 15 I think actually involved, and some of them are like croupiers on the tables, kind of running the individual tables. Some of them are in the middle, sort of giving us news bulletins and running the credit ratings, where each table has a credit rating which appears on a screen up there, and so it's actually a very tightly scripted and carefully choreographed shows. And there are moments, particularly when the market starts to go into meltdown, when all of the cast have to be sort of running around the floor, kind of trying to work out which tables are going down and which aren't. And it's quite tightly scripted. It's very tightly choreographed, I would say. And it really is quite a work of art, as well as being a game that the audience can play. Yeah. And the combination of those two things is just a mark of how brilliant this company are. I mean, that no other company on the fringe has rivaled them in recent years for just the scale of the recognition they've had and the amount of enjoyment and inspiration people have had from their shows, and they are tremendously talented. And it was quite interesting to hear Alexander de Vriend, their artistic director, talking yesterday at an awards ceremony in Edinburgh, where he talked about what Edinburgh had meant to them in terms of giving their work access to a wider audience and really making it known to the world. And that's been a very rich relationship over the last 8 or 9 years, I think it is, since they first appeared here.
Sorry to interrupt, but the reason that I'm mentioning Internal, which was a sort of combination of speed dating and group therapy show, in which the audience, individual members feel as though they have a huge input. The reason I'm raising that show is that, exactly as Joyce is saying, this is entirely, a script is maybe not the right word, but it is a controlled environment in which they know exactly what they're trying to do and what effect they're trying to achieve. The audience, because you are gambling or you are having a speed dating thing, you think, oh yeah, this is all me, but actually they're the ones who are in charge.
Well, I go a step further, because they're actors, you think, but these are far more than actors, because they're reacting, they're changing their responses depending on what happens in front of them, which makes it even... This is going to sound awful, but I have to say that I felt it was a bit rushed. The one thing I loved was people shorting each other. They didn't know what they were doing. They were shorting each other, which is fantastic. So they were taking away from their fellows and loving it.
Yeah,
I did a lot of shorting.
Yeah, it kind of got a little bit rushed. And I have to say that I think if they'd swapped running time with Alan Ayckbourn and they'd had the 6 hours and Alan Ayckbourn had maybe 2, I would have been desperately unhappy personally. But that's probably controversial, so I would not say
I think it could have been longer.
And there's another show that's at Summerhall, which I haven't seen, which lasted all day, and it was about a couple splitting up, and it was like an improvised splitting up thing, and you could just go in and...
Is that the one from New Zealand?
5 hours, over 5 hours.
I think it was the New Zealand one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all fascinating. Let's each pick a couple of shows that we think people might enjoy or maybe get challenged by.
Get something out of it.
Ivy, you want to start?
Well, oddly, in the same territory as Lies, Foreign Radical is a show from part of the Canada Hub that's a really interesting Canadian
which is at Summerhall as well.
Summerhall, yes, at the King's Hall, around the corner from Summerhall. And Foreign Radical is from a company called Theatre Conspiracy from British Columbia, directed by Jeremy Waller and written by Tim Carlson. And Foreign Radical, in not a dissimilar way to Lies, engages the audience and gets under the skin of the audience. In this case, the theme is borders, moving from one country to another, and where the finger of suspicion might point against somebody who might be a foreign radical. And by asking us, the audience, a series of questions and dividing us and redividing us and subdividing us over the whole of the event, you suddenly realise how guilty you personally might look, and also you're asked to point the finger at the other people in the audience, which one looks guilty. And very cleverly and sophisticatedly it asks all of those questions, which means, and it doesn't, the thing is, although it points to both Obama's and Trump's legislation or rules to do with who can come in and out of the United States, it doesn't only play the easy liberal card and say, oh yes, well let's be against the sort of restrictive practices, because actually it turns around on you and says, well, what would you do? If you were in control, what would you do? And I think it again, I've used that phrase, it gets under your skin, it challenges you in the best way.
And second show?
And the second show, we haven't mentioned Nassim, which is a show that's at the Travis, which asks which is deceptive. It gives it's one of these shows where there's a different performer on every single show who is reading the script unseen. And it feels like a bit of a game. It's like, oh, isn't it funny that somebody's reading a script for the first time? But actually what you realise that this is a fantastic metaphor for somebody whose voice is not being allowed to be heard in their own land or in their own native tongue, in this case the Farsi language. And it's actually one of the most moving plays of the festival.
Joyce?
Well, I think it would be wrong not to talk in relation to this Fringe about the fantastic voices of young black women that have been heard on this Fringe. Typically it's been a slightly sort of Fringe so white event at the Fringe, but this year there have been some serious efforts to set up a website for young black women writing about theatre and so on related to the Fringe, and to encourage young black women to be here, and they are here, and some of the voices are absolutely astonishing. I mean, right back at the beginning of the Fringe we started out with Josette Bouchot-Mingo's wonderful show about Nina Simone, which has already been seen in London, and that kind of set the tone for some very angry and very challenging work, particularly in the light of what's happening in the United States at the moment, about the legacies of colonialism, about racism in the United States and in other parts of the West, and about what this current generation of young black people can do to actually move things on, because it seems that all of this struggle has been going on for so long and there are still so many issues still persisting. So the shows I'd like to mention very quickly are a wonderful show which is showing at the Gilded Balloon called Woke, W-O-K-E, as in woken up, which is by a young Scottish woman, Scottish-based American artist called Afia Campbell, who is herself a young black woman, and it's a wonderful monologue with songs about a very naive young black student from Pittsburgh who arrives in St. Louis in the autumn of 2014, just as all the riots in Ferguson are kicking off, and she believes in America, she believes in justice, she goes along to Ferguson out of pure naive curiosity, and the things that she sees and experiences there sets her off on a journey towards a much more radical stance in terms of what's happening to black people in America, and all of this is reflected in the songs she sings, which is wonderful. From the point of view of Britain, there's a wonderful monologue at Summerhall in the Northern Stage season there called Salt, by a wonderful young British performer called Selena Thompson, who in her mid-20s, as a young black woman growing up in Birmingham, just began to think about the history of slavery and about how all of her family on various sides had been slaves, and was seized with this impulse to kind of retrace the journey, kind of backwards, the journey that they made from the Caribbean, from West Africa to Caribbean and back again to Europe. And she does that on a kind of tramp steamer, and this is a beautifully written and performed kind of poetic evocation of her anger and the pain that she feels, and of what she does to try and work her way through that. So that's absolutely fantastic. And it's also very much worth seeing a show, one of the 6, which has come from the Baxter Theatre in Cape Town, with great difficulty, it has to be said. Big company from the Baxter, with very little help from their own government, have come here. And one of the shows is called The Fall.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah?
Because I was going to pick 2 shows, and one of my 2 was The Fall.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting, because I've seen, I think I'm going to be around about 80 shows now, maybe 70 plus anyway. And of the 2 that struck me most, the whole South African season from the Baxter Theatre Company at University of Cape Town, broadcast by Lara Foote, is amazing. The Fall is the most powerful political play I've seen in ages, because, as we understand it, it's built up by a group of about 7 young people, all in their early mid-20s now, all of whom were at the University of Cape Town 2 years ago in 2015, when the Rhodes Must Fall movement started, which was about the statue of Cecil Rhodes, who was the big colonialist of whom we've probably all heard. And he'd come to represent kind of the bogeyman for all of these people. And the passion of the delivery of these 7 people, they were untrained as actors or anything, as far as I can tell, and suddenly they turn themselves into a theatre company. They're incredibly close, they're incredibly well choreographed, which may be down to them, it may not, and you kind of feel like the battles they're having amongst themselves are genuine battles. The times when they reach tacit agreement is genuine, and their feelings and passion for the whole story are just amazing, and it just blew me away completely. Was that roughly what you were going to say?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
Yeah,
and the other one, so I really wanted to pick up on, what seemed to be the big theme this year, one of the two big themes this year, which is depression. And just picking one of the many shows about depression, but the one that was perhaps the most uplifting, if that doesn't sound contradictory, and I hope I can get the title right, is a super happy story about feeling super sad, which in many ways was an hour-long, gentle, little, happy little musical about some young people, probably in their 20s, maybe just about verging into 30, until you realise that the central character is actually suffering from suicidal depression at times. And somehow she goes through terrible experiences, she's interrupted by happy songs, everything goes really badly wrong, her whole life heads downhill fast. And you feel it's by John Britton, so I should have said, and you feel even at the end of it where it ends with what is a good moment, you just can't rely on the fact that by the end of The Fringe it couldn't have a completely different ending. Did either of you see that? Or?
Yes, we've both seen it. Yes, it is a very big theme on this year's Fringe, sort of mental health and this kind of inner sadness, even of young people who know themselves to be very, very privileged and who find it the more difficult to deal with an illness like depression because of knowing that in a lot of ways they shouldn't be complaining, their lives seem to be fine. And that's that we, certainly at the Scotsman, we felt that was one of the strongest of the shows on that theme this year.
Thank you very much to both of you. We've all sacrificed our Saturday night for this, so I hope listeners are going to appreciate it. Marc, Joyce, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.